Defence Dialogue, a podcast discussing contemporary challenges in the area of European security and defence. Brought to you by the Martin Centre with Niklas Novaky.
Welcome everybody to another episode of the Martin Centre's Defence Dialogue podcast series. My name is Dr. Niklas Novaky. Very happy to have you join us again for the first episode of 2023. And I'm also extremely happy because today we have not just one, but two guests joining me for this episode. We have Garvan Walshe, visiting fellow. Welcome, Garvan. And also we have very good friend Julian Bonnici from the communications team joining us for the first time. So
thanks for having me too.
Very happy to have both of you gentlemen join. And it's an interesting time. It's a very interesting time we're living because I'm sure perhaps you noticed, the bulletin of the atomic scientists turned the symbolic doomsday clock yesterday to 90 minutes to midnight, which is the closest it has ever been to midnight. And midnight symbolizes the closeness of existential disaster that the Earth might be facing. It's something that the bulletin of the atomic scientists have been doing since the Cold War, and during the Cold War it was never closer to 2 minutes to midnight. So these are indeed quite troubling times, and according to the bulletin, one of the main reasons why it was turned this close to midnight was the ongoing war in Ukraine, which in this town as well continues to be the main topic of discussion. We had yesterday a meeting of EU Foreign Affairs ministers in the Foreign Affairs Council, and the ministers discussed the forthcoming EU-Ukraine summit, which will take place in Kiev in the beginning of February, and also another forthcoming assistance package to Ukraine via the European Peace Facility, the always ironically named European Peace Facility, which has provided lethal arms and other, through which the EU is financing the supply of lethal arms and other equipment to Ukraine. And I think with this new package, the total level of that assistance will go beyond 3 billion, so quite significant. But even more important than that, the main topic that has been on the news for the past couple of weeks has been the issue of supplying main battle tanks to Ukraine, and especially German Leopard 2s. There's been quite a lot of international pressure that has been put on Germany over the last couple of weeks. Berlin has been quite cautious, not really wanting to supply main battle tanks without getting other countries on board. There's been a special emphasis on getting Leopard 2s to Ukraine because, firstly, it would help Ukraine fight back against Russia. It would make it easier for them to deoccupy some of the territories. But secondly, there's a fairly large pool of Leopard 2s that are also used by other European countries. So potentially Ukraine could draw from a fairly large pool. But finally, in the news today, at the time of recording, and we are recording this episode on Wednesday, the 25th of January, there have been reports that in the afternoon of today, Chancellor Olaf Scholz will announce that indeed Germany will provide about a company of Leopard 2s to Ukraine, so that'll be about 14 tanks. And then in addition, the US will be providing some M1 Abrams tanks to give a little bit of cushion, international support to Germany. And then, of course, other countries would most likely provide some tanks as well. So indeed, important decision, important sign of support for Ukraine. And we have to see it kind of where this goes from here. So it's very interesting to hear your opinions as well, gentlemen, and where the support might go from here and what will happen next.
So there's an interesting thing with these tanks because it's there's a video of Arafat and Ehud Barak saying, as they're going into Camp David, after you, and in the end, Bill Clinton comes and shoves them through the door. It's been a bit like that, where Germany and Poland and everyone else have been saying, no, you supply these first, and you need the Americans to finally say, come on, just all of you, go in at once. We've seen that Spain's also announced that it's going to send some together with, so you've got Spain, Poland, I think Finland has promised us sort of token force, but because obviously it still needs many of its tanks for defense against Russia, but I think could make a big difference on the logistics and maintenance because they have a lot of experience with them. It's important for Ukraine not to have to operate 5 or 6 different types of tanks.
Yeah,
they'll find ways of doing it, but it's a real pain. So although there are small numbers of Challenger 2s from the UK, there'll be small numbers of Leclercs from France. These really are there for diplomatic cover for Germany rather than to have the main force. There are about 1,000 tanks in European armies that are Leopard 1s and Leopard 2s. Not all of them are entirely usable because we've got Finland stocks, we've got the old German stocks that need a lot of maintenance. The manufacturer said it would take them about a year to get those back into working order. Now, maybe they're over-promising and under-delivering, as manufacturers often do, but still, there's a lot of work to be done there. I don't think Greece and Turkey are going to be giving up their Leopard tanks either, though it would be nice if they could be persuaded to agree to send an equal number of tanks so the balance was maintained between those two NATO allies. But I think it's important because if Ukraine can manage to get 300 or 400 tanks together for the spring, they stand a good chance of being able to punch some holes in the defensive lines that Russia has been building up and punching them directly. Because so far their main tactic has been this kind of really advanced industrialized guerrilla war where they've been aiming for logistical depots, supply dumps, railheads, all the things that support the Russian war machine. And because Russia hasn't been able to protect them, they've often had to fall back. But sometimes you do need direct frontal assaults. The war has sort of, frozen into a bit of a World War I type trench stalemate with the Russians digging in on the east bank of the Dnipro and the Ukrainians, struggling at the moment to get over or waiting at the moment to get over. And while they can interfere with supplies to a certain extent, then at some point you need heavy combined arms maneuver to be able to punch through defenses. That's actually what happened exactly in World War I itself, when tanks were invented and then were able to push through the defensive lines. Now these days tanks also are usually supported by aircraft. That's a separate discussion. Maybe we'll come on to it later in the program. But Ukraine isn't going to have offensive air capacity by this spring offensive. That would certainly take longer to set up, even if we had diplomatic support for it, which isn't quite there.
Really interesting. No, but my sort of whole perspective on this at the moment is really how Russia might respond to it, right? I think the Russian ambassador to the US already sort of described it as a blatant provocation. As you said, this is sort of steamrolling other European countries providing tanks. Where do you two sort of see this going? Maybe that's my question. I think the question on everyone's lips.
Well, I think we have to first of all remember that this is something that the Russians have been kind of saying since the very beginning. I mean, and when we talked even more modest support, and they've been kind of warning constantly about the escalatory potential of whenever Ukraine's Western partners in the European Union, the United States and others are providing. But I mean, I think we have to be absolutely careful about clear about the fact that the entire reason why there is the war is because Russia launched an unprovoked attack in February of last year, and if anybody is escalating, it's Russia. And the European Union, Ukraine, the West more broadly are simply trying to ensure that Ukraine continues to exist as an independent sovereign country, and that Russia is unable to annex parts of Ukraine as it did in 2014 when it annexed Crimea. But these are scare tactics. I mean, they are meant to scare Ukraine's Western backers. They are meant to scare the population and the electorate of European countries. But so far, it hasn't really worked. And even in Germany, where there is significant hesitation among the ruling SPD, and also within the German electorate, I think still about 50% of the population is quite strongly in favor of delivering these tanks to Ukraine, which is very, very significant considering that Germany's security and defense culture has traditionally been quite pacifist. So, and if we think that today we're at a moment in which the German government is thinking of sending, or will announce that it will send Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine, it's absolutely incredible. And hopefully these tanks will make a real difference. And it's an impressive piece of machinery. The armor is heavier than some of the armored personnel carriers that Ukraine has already received, and those armored personnel carriers, could be wounded, destroyed with a single soldier-held anti-tank missile system. These will be a bit more difficult to damage. They will require much heavier weaponry. So in that sense as well, like, I mean, it will give a Ukraine, I think, a much deserved edge, like when pushing against the Russian defensive lines.
How do you, I mean, you've sort of seen these up close, Niklas, and I mean, do you know how they cope with artillery attack? Because that's mostly what Russia's sending over. The Russian army is principally an artillery army, and can they make it through barrages, at least for some time? And
that's a good question. I mean, that I remember when I did my military service in Finland, and we saw some of the Leopard 2s in action, that they can withstand a much heavier anti-tank missile than standard armored personal carriers, because the protection and the armor is heavier. But how would they withstand an artillery, like barrage artillery fire? I do not know, but I would think that probably depends on the concentration of the artillery fire and the type of artillery munition they used. I think they will standard artillery shrapnel. They probably withstand a lot better than armored personnel carriers that have been provided. But yeah, it's something that we should actually check, see like what is said.
Because it's artillery that Ukraine was able to use to destroy a lot of the Russian advance.
Yeah,
and now these are more primitive tanks. They have these terribly self-destructive autoloaders, which means that they store a lot of ammunition right behind the turret. So it means tanks can fire more quickly, but it also means if you destroy the autoloader, the whole tank blows up and it sort of pops its top.
Yeah.
You see in the sort of jack-in-the-box kind of effect of the turrets just being blown off and separated from the whole tank. And that was one of the things that really hit the Russian advance quite badly. But it also need to go a bit further into things like the maintenance and recovery fleet for the tanks. If the Ukrainians can have all the other subsidiary equipment that helps them keep the tanks in the field longer, keeps fueling them, allows them to be pulled back out of the fight and repaired, then the Leopard 2s can go much further. We know the Russians have pretty poor logistics, pretty poor repair crews. So it may be that 300 Ukrainian maintained tanks might be worth 400 or 500 Russian maintained tanks.
Exactly, and it'll be interesting to see how they will cope with the maintenance side of things, because something that has been mentioned quite a lot in the discussions on the Leopard 2, but then also especially relating to the other tanks like the M1 Abrams is the challenge of fueling, maintaining, and keeping them up in service, and this will of course require additional efforts from the Ukrainians. Perhaps it will also require additional efforts from the Europeans. There was, at the end of last year, one of the final European Peace Facility assistance packages that were agreed, also included funding for maintaining existing equipment that have already been transferred to Ukraine. So perhaps there needs to be an increase in that amount as well, like in future subsequent packages. I mean, if we are to expect and hope that Ukraine is able to maintain these equipment. So yeah, I mean, just delivering them is one thing. Keeping them up and running will be a different thing.
And the Abrams are interesting in that respect because they use aviation fuel. They're which would need Ukraine to conduct an entirely different supply chain for that. However, the fact they use aviation fuel is in itself interesting, because if there are systems to transport aviation fuel around Ukraine, well, there are certain other things that might be able to use aviation fuel. The clue is in the name. So could this be the way of starting to see how Ukraine can develop a bit more air capacity? They've so far been heroic in their use of Soviet-era aircraft, in keeping their airspace open in the way that nobody expected them to do. Everyone thought they'd lose air. Russia would get air superiority in about 3 days. They haven't done that. They only managed air superiority in places like Mariupol, where they were able to send heavy bombers in because they managed to reduce the Ukrainian defense enough. But in the rest of the country, the Ukrainian Air Force still flies sorties. The Ukrainian Air Force also has a surplus of pilots. They couldn't keep them, basically, because they couldn't pay them. So they trained lots of pilots. The pilots went off to fly commercial jets. But obviously they've come back to defend their country now. So they're running short of airframes. And the interesting thing comes, what airframes could they use? There was the unfortunate episode of accidentally announcing the supply of MiGs from Eastern Europe at the beginning of the war. It would have been better if the Russians just suddenly realized oh gosh, we're against more of these than we thought.
Yeah.
And Something like that seems to have happened in the end, with parts of MiGs being transmitted. Now, it may have been broken down into 2 or 3 parts, fuselage and 2 wings, and then put back together again. It's important that remember that a lot of this military assistance isn't advertised.
Yeah,
the Nordic countries particularly don't supply detailed figures. France doesn't supply detailed figures. There's a lot of considerable assistance going in there.
Yeah, the Finns usually say that they do not want to give the exact figures or the exact type of the assistance that is given, because it could give the Russians an edge in fighting back and then destroying that assistance. And I guess, there are many other countries that follow the same model. But I'm wondering, after the Leopard 2 tanks, this war, unfortunately, it looks like it will continue at least for some time. We're approaching the 1-year mark, which will be on the 24th of February. So what would be the next step after the Leopards? You mentioned the MiGs, Garvan. So do you think that we could eventually revisit the discussion around fighter aircraft, for example?
I think we should revisit that discussion, and I think we should start that discussion with air war doctrine. Traditionally, the Western type of air war doctrine is to establish air superiority very fast. Our armed forces tend to put most of their firepower in the air, and the idea is that you suppress the enemy air defenses quickly. And once you do that, you then have freedom to choose to attack whichever target you like. This is much harder in this situation, because you could only do that by attacking significant parts of Russian territory. And while I'm generally skeptical of Russia's threats of escalation, attacking significant, Russian military installations in a sort of 1,000-kilometer range from the border, which is what you're looking at if you wanted to do suppression of Russian air defense, would quite reasonably be construed as a serious attack on the Russian Federation. So that option is difficult. It also needs a tremendous amount, diplomatically, it also needs a tremendous amount of scale to pull off. So we need to start thinking about how could Ukraine have an air capacity that would allow it to push the Russians back from where they're currently firing cruise missiles on Ukrainian cities, without having to have a full air superiority over Russia, which is unrealistic. You'd want the Ukrainians to be able to deter the Russian Air Force from being able to launch attacks into Ukraine from air-launched platforms. You want to deter them from flying their fighters because they're worried about replacing them. But you can't realistically expect them to suppress Russian air defenses, across major parts of European Russia. It means you need to start looking at aircraft that could be able to operate in a fairly hostile environment. So you're looking at aircraft that don't need huge amounts of maintenance. You're looking at aircraft that can take off and land in surprising places. You're looking at aircraft that can conduct a variety of missions as well. The ideal one probably would have been the Harrier, which was designed to take off and land from the middle of jungles, from all kinds of places. Vertically, but it's not really in use anymore. The U.S. Marines still have some, but they mostly use them to repair their existing fleet. The Brits discontinued them, I think, probably 10 years ago, maybe a bit longer.
I think I remember reading as well that it's not really used anymore. I think the main vertical takeoff fighter that is now used is being introduced incrementally to defense forces in Europe and elsewhere is the F-35. But that'll be a completely different beast to maintain, and I don't think there will be a lot of enthusiasm to give very expensive F-35s to Ukraine.
But I think where there is a middle ground, and that's the Swedish Gripen. Which it can't quite vertically take off and land, but it can land on very short airstrips. It can be maintained by relatively small teams, and it was designed because Sweden is actually strategically in the same kind of position as Ukraine. If it had to develop its own independent defense doctrine against a Russian attack, it knew that there was no possibility of Sweden, establishing enough firepower to conduct the suppression of Russian air defenses around Moscow and St. Petersburg. So they have to be able to also operate in a hostile environment. The difficulty with the Gripens is there aren't that many of them. There's a few hundred. It's enough for Sweden's needs. Quite a few of them in Brazil, but and obviously more could be manufactured. But if Sweden were to supply them to Ukraine, Sweden would then be quite vulnerable itself. And Sweden is not in NATO yet. Sweden is also in strategically more vulnerable situation. So perhaps, I mean, there is a possibility here where the UK could come in. It has quite a few Eurofighters that are available. They haven't. There's some talk of them being sold to Turkey, but that hasn't happened yet. And so you could imagine if the UK could use its security treaty with Sweden to fill in for the Gripens, then the Gripens could then be prepared to be introduced into the Ukrainian theater. Yes, this would alarm Russians, but this doesn't even need to be announced. This is the kind of thing that can happen.
Exactly. You don't have to kind of make a huge fuss out of it. And like the Russians would certainly react the way that, I mean, they've been reacting to every single step, like on the way, and like make the same remarks as they have. But
and then they'd probably just withdraw their air forces.
Probably. One would assume.
The Russian Air Force seems very reluctant to lose aircraft.
And Sweden, of course, is, the challenges are similar, but then Sweden, of course, is protected a little bit by the buffer zone of Finland, like between Russia and Sweden, like, which has served them rather well in the past. But Julian, you wanted to jump in?
No, just to see what your take would be on the international appetite to take sort of to help in that kind of support. We've seen sort of a lot of months of sort of soul searching just to supply tanks. I mean,
it's $1 million or $1 billion question, I mean, quite literally, because we're talking about like very expensive equipment being provided. But I think kind of I would just say that we were lucky with how relatively mild the winter has been. I think which has maintained willingness in quite a few European countries to continue to supply Ukraine. We can see this from several opinion polls that have come out, like in recent weeks and months. The willingness to show solidarity to Ukraine is high, like pretty much across the board in Europe. And then this willingness amongst the population like reflects higher up to the political decision makers. But how long will this last? I mean, that is impossible to tell at the moment. At the moment, though, I mean, what is good is that the willingness is high, and I think the West more broadly, but Europe in particular, like seems to be thinking that they are not providing assistance to Ukraine simply or purely out of solidarity and purely out of a sense of benevolence, but it's also because it is very much in their interest. It is in their interest to weaken the fighting capacity of the Russian armed forces. It is in their interest to like tie Russia down in Ukraine and make a stand in Ukraine, and rather than encourage Putin then to perhaps, if he succeeds in annexing territory in Ukraine, he could try doing the same thing in other countries in Europe. So making a clear stand in Ukraine in that sense is standing our ground. But inflation is still high. The energy security challenges in Europe haven't quite been solved completely yet or in a satisfactory way, even though at the moment, like, we're looking at energy prices like going down. But I think it really comes down to, well, two things. How much weapons stockpiles are left. Many of the equipment that European countries have had in their stockpiles are getting unfortunately rather low. The European Union is currently working on an instrument to try to replenish some of these stockpiles, which should be accepted as soon as possible. But then secondly, also like the support among the population. Because if people are eventually turn unhappy, if they are unable to pay their energy bills, we can look into a very quick change also in attitude, unfortunately.
I mean, I think you can distinguish two regions of Europe here. On the one hand, you have those countries that are close to Russia and have an immediate strategic interest in seeing Russia weakened and seeing the Russian military as far away as possible. By which I mean the Nordic states, the Baltic states, Poland, also to a certain extent Romania and Bulgaria, and they are clearly committed to having a continued support of a war effort in Russia, because they know they need it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And there are some other countries a bit further away, but still pretty committed, like the UK and the Netherlands, that understand the strategic need for this involvement. And then there's a second level, Germany, France, Italy, where there were a lot of worries about public opinion. And there, what's quite interesting is, I think the worries should not be for public opinion, they're for elite opinion. The public has turned out to be much more robust and much more resolute in its support for Ukraine than foreign policy elites have thought. Partly, I think they just see the barbarity of what Russia's doing, and then understand that this thing simply can't be tolerated and somewhere so close to them. They see cities being attacked. They see military operations that resemble World War II, let alone even the Bosnian War. And every time, new territory is liberated, new war crimes are discovered, new massacres are found, Russian tactics almost seem designed to inflame Western public opinion.
Absolutely.
And if you see on your screens that people are shivering in -20 degrees without heat, it makes people angry rather than
absolutely.
And it's particularly since Western governments have managed to prepare their countries, with the ironic exception of Hungary, which I'm going to come back a second, to deal with this crisis. And also there's been a mild winter. Mostly they put policies in place to allow people to weather them. German industry was complaining a lot at the beginning, but have actually just managed to massively improve the efficiency of their use of energy.
Yeah.
Which is excellent, because they now produce stuff more efficient than they could. They move some production elsewhere. There were some stories that, we've had to leave our lights off in the factories at the weekend. And I think, well, that's good, because that improves energy efficiency. It helps the fight against climate change by reducing the need for fossil fuels. And they've been able to do this while keeping output at least level. This shows the strength and adaptability of democratic capitalist systems, that they're able to deal with quite a few of these shocks in a pretty adaptable and robust way. Now, I want to come back to Hungary. I was just talking to some friends who were visiting yesterday, and they were saying that their universities are not opening until February. Theaters have closed. Lots of communal spaces in big cities in Hungary are closed just simply because they can't afford the heating. They had depended on certain cheap deals from Russia. Those deals are now in question, though there are still. Though Hungary hasn't carved out from the sanctions regimes, loss of confidence in Orban's government has meant the currency's fallen, which has driven inflation even higher, so 20%, 40% in food. And so they're almost suffering another lockdown because of their own foolish geopolitical alignment. So instead of being buffered by their government, like is happening in most other European countries, in Hungary, the problem is exacerbated. And it's too early to see how public opinion will react. The studies haven't been done, but it's looking like it was a terrible blunder by Orban to present himself as the outlier in the West who could still talk to Putin.
Yeah, it is incredible, like how strong the public support has been throughout the board, and in many ways, I think you're absolutely right that the response of many Western countries have been driven more by like the high level of public support, like among ordinary people, like rather than initial strong support, like among political decision makers, and it has created a pressure to act, a pressure to do something that has probably, I think, surprised quite a lot of policymakers, quite a lot of leaders. It was certainly a surprise also in Finland and I think in Sweden, the extent to which public support went for NATO membership went above 50% for the first time ever when the war began, and now it's in 60s or in the 70s or 80s, and it was really the public support that also drove that discussion. Before we conclude, I just wanted to ask Julian if you have any final kind of comments or perhaps kind of views, because we've talked about public support quite a lot, like from the perspective of Malta, because Malta is an interesting case, being a neutral EU member state outside NATO. Is there a strong public support for these European measures in Malta as well?
Yes, I would think so. So I'm one of those people who was quite a cynic. So I think when the war first broke out and there was this outpouring of public support, part of me in my back of my mind, maybe it's my journalist side, whatever, sort of said, people are going to forget about this, sort of like what happened in Crimea, and then it will flare up again in a few years' time. In Malta, the public support has been super strong, I think, so far. Unfortunately, what I would say is sometimes when it's a smaller nation, maybe on the periphery of the EU, not so close, the issues like inflation and sanctions because of it sort of get a lot more criticism. I think even Malta's Prime Minister, Malta's Finance Minister have spoken out against it. Where I think there's still a bit of struggle is necessarily the EU or maybe bigger bodies sort of communicating why sanctions are effective. You know, Martin Center actually had a really interesting report on the matter, so go read it out. But I think there could be more done to maybe explain to people, you know, what's being done and why it's working and how it's working.
No, you're absolutely right. But yeah, so we'll have a lot has been done, a lot is happening at the moment, and a lot more will probably be done in the coming weeks and months. Hopefully, Ukraine will continue to have the capacity to fight back, to deoccupy some of the areas, and we will certainly continue to follow what is happening at the Martin Center, and we will continue to brief you in the coming weeks and months as well. But at this point, I would like to thank both Garvan and Julian for joining me in this episode of the Defense Dialogue podcast series. And I would also like to thank all of you who tuned in to listen to our little discussion from wherever you are listening. Hopefully you will have a wonderful day, and please do join us again in the coming weeks and months for additional episodes. Thanks a lot and have a good day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was today's episode of Defense Dialogue. Subscribe to our podcasts for more.